So our next speaker is Ann Castle, who in her private practice worked in water issues, and many of them Western Colorado oriented. She went into the Obama administration, became the Assistant Secretary for the Department of Interior overseeing reclamation and the USGS, which we've both heard about. And now she's in academia, so she's been on the outside but involved, overseeing all these issues and urging people along, and now she is in academia as an observer with the benefit of those past experiences. So Ann's talk is going to connect a lot of dots, a lot of the narratives that we've heard about. One of the laws of physics and others is every action has a reaction. So think about these things as Ann Castle goes through her program. Ann.
Thanks, Jim, and thanks to the River District for putting on this great conference. I've been thinking, as I've been listening to all the presentations over the morning and at lunch, that this is such a great education and a great continuum of information and data and ideas about where we go next. And of course, where we go next is thinking about the next set of operating guidelines for the Colorado River. The 2007 guidelines expire in 2025, at the end of 2025. And there's a provision in those guidelines that says that consultation will begin about how they've worked no later than December of next year, December of 2020. So we know that reclamation is going to kick that process off sometime in 2020. So it's a really good time for us to be thinking about what that next version of the guidelines ought to look like. And we have the opportunity to think about what we've learned and how we can create a better operating regime. And I think that's what a lot of the speakers so far today have addressed. What I've been thinking about and what I want to talk about today is some of the disconnects that are currently embedded in the 2007 operating guidelines, disconnects between actions and consequences, and some of the incentives and disincentives that are buried in those guidelines and the behavior that results in. So I'm going to talk about a framework that we can use to think about the next set of guidelines and some principles that we might consider to test these various different proposals against. So I'm going to start with my cocktail napkin. This is just another way of looking at the water balance in the basin. As Doug said, there's lots of different ways to do this. And these numbers are approximations. They come from various different data sources, and I did check them out with Eric Kuhn. He's not to blame if you disagree with them. And there are lots of different ways to measure some of this stuff. But this is my construction of the water balance that we find ourselves in right now. So natural flows, this is at the international boundary, and this is corrected for a whole bunch of stuff. Only for the last 19 years, so just the most recent period where we've seen these decreased flows, 13.2 million acre feet on average. And then we have outflows of 15 million acre feet or more. That consists of all the things that are depicted in yellow on this slide. So we have upper basin uses, lower basin contracts. The lower basin contracts are for 7.5 million acre feet, but in recent years, the lower basin has voluntarily cut back as a result of various different conservation agreements, and the DCP will continue that as well. So 7 to 7.5 million acre feet in contracts. There's a lot of evaporation and losses in the lower basin, at least 1 million acre feet, maybe more. The Gila River and other tributaries of the main stem account for a bunch of use that we don't have a real good handle on. This is probably the area where we have the least amount of information about how much use is occurring. So I've just said approximately 1.2 million acre feet. We know we have a 1.5 million acre foot obligation to Mexico. All that adds up to 15 million plus. And so we have a balance in the red. 1.9 to 2.4 million acre feet. That's a minus number. That's why it's red. So that's the problem. And as we've heard, it's quite likely to get worse. We have Brad's work and all the information that Brad and Jeff presented this morning. So we could see a 20 to 30% reduction in flows by 2050, which is getting really close to where we are right now, and 35 to 55% reduction by the end of this century. So, I mean, it's sort of incomprehensible to me. It's hard for me to wrap my head around a 50% potential reduction in flows and how that plays out in the basin. So that creates a bunch of challenges. We have well-established uses of water in the lower basin in excess of inflows. We've been able to do that because there's a lot of storage in Lake Mead, and there's also the additional releases from the upper basin that were talked about earlier, and I'm going to talk about some more. But the point is that we have whole sectors of the economy, economic sectors, geographic sectors that have gotten used to using those additional flows. And that's something that you can't just turn off the switch. So we've got that to deal with. Declining water availability, we just talked about. Growing demand, or at best static demand. Maybe our uses don't grow, but we know we have proposals for new development in the upper basin, and those could result in additional demand, putting more stress on the system. We have tribal development of water rights. The recent tribal water study that Reclamation completed last year says that there's about 1 million acre feet of either unused or unadjudicated water just in the upper basin in tribal claims. So some of that is settlement water that's currently not used because the tribes don't have the infrastructure to put it to use. Or in some cases, it's claims that have not yet been settled or adjudicated, but that's a big number. So that's a potential source of additional demand in the upper basin. And then we have environmental needs. And certainly the recreation economy, the economy built on healthy flowing rivers in the West Slope is one that you are all aware of and that we need to keep in mind when we're thinking about what the future looks like. So the goals, obviously, bring the system into balance. I think we need to phase out subsidies that we currently have for overuse, and I'm going to talk some more about that. And then I'd suggest we need to let the states decide how risk-averse or risk-taking they want to be, and then live with those consequences. And I'll talk more about that as well. And finally, I think we need to connect actions with consequences. So let me explain what I mean by that. And I'll start with the upper basin, or the lower basin, sorry. We've heard discussions about the structural deficit, and basically that's part of that, that red minus number on my cocktail napkin slide. And it's basically the lower basin when you account for evaporation and all the different uses and the lower basin's obligation to Mexico, half of the 1.5 million acre feet. That's more than the average inflows to Lake Mead, and that's been estimated at about 1.2 million acre feet. So there's a structural deficit there. What that means is that the level of Lake Mead drops because that's where the water's coming from that is being used to supply all of those uses. The rules that we have in place now in the 2007 guidelines require balancing releases from Lake Powell when Lake Mead levels go low. And we've seen slides about how, at least in recent years, we've been releasing from Lake Powell usually 9 million acre feet above the target of 8.23. So what that means is that that overuse in the lower basin is being subsidized by those above average releases from Lake Powell, and the lower basin doesn't feel the full cost, the full consequence of that overuse. And this slide was put up before. This is the famous Central Arizona Project slide on the right. And it was designed to show how the system in Lake Mead can be manipulated so that a 9 million acre foot release from Lake Powell is triggered. And it caused a lot of irritation in the upper basin and some strongly worded letters, but it's not wrong. It's absolutely correct that if you keep Lake Mead levels in that sweet spot that's shown in green, then that will trigger a 9.0 million acre foot release from Lake Powell. So the result of all this is that lower basin overuse is subsidized, and that upper basin savings at the moment in Lake Powell don't benefit the upper basin because they get balanced away. They get released from Lake Powell to balance, equalize levels in Lake Mead. Now, that is partially mitigated by the demand management storage agreement that's part of the drought contingency plan set of agreements that were signed in May. But that agreement says, number one, there'll be a space in Lake Powell where the upper basin can store water, and it'll be free of balancing, but only if you set up a demand management agreement or demand management program, which we haven't, and which we may or may not. I mean, you heard several speakers today raise questions about whether a demand management program is good for the West Slope or for any of us. So we may or may not have a demand management program that would trigger this free space in Lake Powell. And it's only for 500,000 acre feet. And some of the modeling work that John Caron and Hydros have done that he'll talk about have suggested that we need a lot bigger free space in Lake Powell in order to give us an insurance policy against compact curtailment. And finally, the result is that the lower basin overuse means that those states are not bearing the full cost of their actions. Now, the economists in this room would call that an externality, where the action doesn't bear the full cost. And here's the way I like to think about it. This is my comparison. Let's say that you're the parent of an adult child. I can relate to that. Maybe some of you in the room can relate to that. And your adult child is employed. Yay. But the kid has a salary that doesn't permit the lifestyle to which he has become accustomed. So, being a kind and thoughtful and benevolent parent, you say, I will subsidize your salary. I'm going to give you an extra 10% a month. Now, I don't want you to use it all the time. I don't want you to become accustomed to it, but it'll be there if you need it. So your adult child, being smart, like you are, and rational, says, I'm going to spend 110% of my salary because it's in my bank account and my parents are putting it there. So that's my analogy. Everybody's being rational and reasonable and benevolent here, but it may not be the best parenting strategy in the long run. So I'm not going to just pick on the lower basin. I'm going to pick on the upper basin as well. And here's the disconnect I see here between actions and consequences. And that is that if we bring new projects, new water development projects online, those projects increase the risk of curtailment for all the uses in the basin, at least all the post-compact uses. And the risk study demonstrates this, and the most recent update for the risk study said that if you have an increase in upper basin consumptive use of 11.5%, which translates to about 500,000 acre-feet, that roughly doubles the risk of curtailment. So new projects coming on the system have an impact on everybody's risk. So the result is there that new projects, the cost of those new projects are spread around the basin, another externality. It's a cost in increased risk, but it's also potentially a cost in the amount of demand management that we will have to do in order to create an insurance policy against the risk of curtailment at a certain level. So new projects are in effect subsidized. So I'll suggest some ways to deal with those disconnects. And starting with the upper basin, I'd say new projects pay their own way. They offset the additional risk that they create. And that's consistent with one of the principles in the conceptual framework that was negotiated before the water plan came into being, but was adopted by the CWCB as part of the Colorado Water Plan. And that one principle says that we need to ensure that diversions by a new Trans Mountain diversion don't unacceptably increase the risk of a compact deficit, so the risk of a compact collar curtailment, or increase the amount of water existing users would have to provide through a demand management program. Now that's just talking about a Trans Mountain diversion, but the same principle applies to any new diversion of water in the upper basin. And there's some complications here. It's not as simple as I'm making it seem, because some of the new projects that are being proposed are what we call IPPs, Identified Projects and Programs, and they were supposed to be grandfathered in and not subject to this principle in the conceptual framework. And there's also the issue that Colorado proportionately uses more of the compact use in the upper basin than its 51.75% that's part of the upper basin compact. So the other states would say, hey, wait a minute, maybe Colorado, you have to subsidize or offset your new development, but we should be able to develop as much as you came to. We should all be able to get to our upper basin proportionate shares without having to do anything different. And that's a legitimate concern and something that would have to be thought about. But the principle, again, is that actions realize their own consequences, that we don't have externalities, that we don't subsidize things that are increasing the cost for everybody else. And then in the lower basin, if the lower basin uses more than its allocation, then the consequences would occur in the lower basin. So that brings in the possible grand bargain solution, and there are different ways to deal with that, as Doug said. All of those things raise the question, exactly what is the lower basin's allocation? And you would think after 100 years we would know that, but we don't. And there's lots of different ways to argue about what the lower basin's allocation is, and that would have to be worked out. But the point is that if lower basin states choose to use more than inflows, which would include the deliveries from the upper basin and any tributary inflows, then they live with the consequences. And we would have balancing to distribute extraordinary inflows, you know, like a 2011 type year, but we wouldn't have balancing to offset overuse. So the basins would live within their hydrological means. You have to do this with a controlled slide. You know, sometimes people talk about, should we have a grand bargain or should we have incrementalism? And I don't think those two are mutually exclusive. I think you can set a goal that would look like a grand bargain and then agree on incremental steps to get there. Because I don't think you can pull the rug out from under existing uses. It's politically not feasible. It's just not going to work. The elected officials or the representatives of the states aren't going to be able to agree to a deal that wipes out some geographical area or economic sector in their state. So you have to have a way to implement this kind of stuff over time, but you could agree on those incremental steps to get there, and agree on what the goal is. So grand bargain ideas, we heard about some of these. I think we'd have a bank in Lake Powell that's bigger than 500,000 acre feet, and it'd be available to us. I think you could use both lakes to store intentionally created surplus. I mean, why not let the lower basin put ICS in Lake Powell? It helps us. It props up levels in Lake Powell. John Ensminger suggested that at the conference in Boulder in June. And you'd have triggers for reductions of deliveries that are based on hydrology, not on Lake Mead levels. Because Lake Mead levels can be manipulated. We see that with the Central Arizona Project slide. It's simply the case that it's been happening. And if the lower basin has control over Lake Mead and lives within their hydrological means, then they can decide at what elevation they're comfortable keeping Lake Mead. But that shouldn't have an impact on the amount of delivery that's required from Lake Powell. We should do that based on hydrology, and I don't personally know why you do it with a forecast. And we could do it just as easily based on existing hydrology and not have to argue about how the forecasting is done. And then I'd suggest that we would, in that grand bargain, have trade-offs that recognize climate change impacts, and that's exactly what Doug was talking about earlier. So some essential components, I think, development of tribal rights. And there's some things that we know are out there, but we always sort of lay them aside because they're so hard to deal with and we don't know what to do about it. Tribal rights is one of those. Not so much the existing rights and existing uses, but the unused tribal water and the unadjudicated claims. I think we have to get a way better handle on that and figure out how we're going to facilitate the tribes in growing into their claims and recognizing what that does to overall use in the basin. We have to think about protection of ecological values. That's actually less of a problem in Colorado as the headwater state than it is in further downstream states, but it's something that is part of the overall Western economy and that has to be a component of any deal. And finally, I think we have to make progress on the Salton Sea. We just saw how failure to address Salton Sea issues almost hung up a drought contingency plan. And the people in Imperial County in California have some absolutely legitimate and almost existential concerns about what the Salton Sea is going to do to them. And there are solutions out there. They're expensive, but I think that we have to include those components in any grand bargain or any form of the next set of guidelines. So goals would be to reduce externalities. Obviously, we design based on the best science available. I don't think anyone would dispute that. And I think we need to include non-traditional stakeholders in the process, like tribes, like environmental NGOs, like the representatives from Imperial County, to make sure that we get a bargain that works for everybody. So I'll just suggest some guiding principles for testing various proposals against. Both basins manage their own supplies and live within their hydrological means, so that there aren't subsidies from upper basin to lower basin, and the consequences occur in the basin where the actions are taken. So that means that each basin or each state can decide how risk-averse or risk-taking they want to be, and there will be differences in those decisions. We see it now in Colorado. There, I think, is a difference between what the Front Range Trans Mountain diverters think would be an acceptable level of risk of curtailment and what the West Slope believes to be an acceptable level of risk. And so there are ways to come together around those kinds of decisions, but I don't know that you can do it across both basins. And I think you can make better decisions if you do that a little more locally. And then finally, the consequences occur in the basin or the state where those actions are taken. So if one state decides to be a little more risk-taking and that doesn't work out for them, consequences occur there. I think if we follow those principles, we will have less incentives for unproductive behavior of overuse or manipulating the system, and we can end up with a better bargain, a better operating regime in the long run. Thank you.
Any questions? Well, I have one while you're thinking. So you brought up an interesting wild card, the tribal water rights. In fact, Jesse worked on the tribal water study that just came out recently. And in Colorado, or at least in the southwest portion of the state where we have tribal presence, they envision 150,000 acre feet of water demand. And in the risk study that John's going to talk about, I think 15,000 of that got into a possible growth scenario. But I guess Doug really didn't mention, you couldn't mention everything, but the tribal wild card is out there. How do we deal with that in this era where people are really starting to count molecules?
Right. Well, I think it is a big issue, and it's one that, like I said, we've sort of put to the side because it's too hard to think about. But I'd point out what happened in Arizona when they were struggling with the sort of last set of agreements that they needed to be able to sign on to the drought contingency plan. And the Gila River Indian community and the Colorado River Indian tribes came in and said, we can help. We have water, and you have money. They were able to work out a deal where each of those tribal communities contributed 50,000 acre feet that would allow some of the uses, the other mostly irrigation uses in Arizona to continue, but still meet the obligations that were required from the DCP. And that's what the other tribes will tell us, that they can be part of the solution, but they need to be involved in the discussions. Now, that sort of neatly skirts the issue of, well, what about this big chunk of currently unused water? And that is really, really tough. We agreed in many cases, sort of as a country, that the tribes were owed that water. A lot of this, these amounts of unused water, at least, are embodied in settlement agreements that have been authorized by Congress. And as a recognition that these tribes were owed that amount of water with their reservations. And that water is not subject to forfeiture. It can be unused for 150 years, and it doesn't matter. But they're owed that water. Now, there can be, I think, creative agreements about how, in return for the money that they need to develop infrastructure on the reservations, they could contribute or lease some of that water to be part of an overall solution. But I think it's going to take money, and it's not going to be an easy process. But unless we involve tribal representatives in those discussions and try to reach win-win solutions like they did in Arizona, then that's another issue, just like climate change, that can come back to bite us, and it won't be good when that happens. So I think we need to get out in front of it.
Rachel?
Thank you so much for the presentation.
Here comes a microphone.
As loud as I am. Thank you again for the presentation and the thoughtfulness going into it. A lot of the discussion today, upper basin, lower basin, seems to hinge on the upper basin all being in concert with each other and in accord. And I guess I'm just kind of wondering how arm in arm are we with Wyoming and Utah in these discussions, especially given that we're overusing our portion of the upper basin's water?
So, I think it depends on what the issue is. I think the upper basin states have been pretty united when discussing lower basin overuse, for example. The issue about Colorado's use, I want to be clear, Colorado's not overusing its allocation. It's just that the Upper Basin Compact says that if there is a compact call, and one state has, over the past 10 years, used more than their percentage share, then that state gets curtailed first. But there's nothing that says we can't do that, and we have been. And nobody's challenged our ability to use that water. It could come back to bite us, but I don't think that's been a source of contention. What's interesting now is that when, as this demand management program is being explored, each upper basin state is doing that independently. It's not at all clear to me that that's going to, all of a sudden, meld together, and we're going to have a consistent upper basin program. And there are going to be big issues there, I think, about if we have this bank in Lake Powell, is it a collective bank? If Colorado puts in more demand management storage than Utah, do we have our little Colorado component of that Lake Powell water bank? We haven't worked any of those issues out. So I think there are issues where there will be significant push and pull among the upper basin states, but I also think that, and I don't really like using these kinds of analogies, but there is a common enemy, and so that does tend to keep the upper basin sort of circled around the wagons.
We have time for another question, if there might be one. Okay, so seeing none, that means you did a very good job.
Okay.
And thank you very much.